From the nation's capital, the American Enterprisednstitute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic, religion and the Constitution.
This Public Policy Forum, one of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, is concerned with the relationship of church and state under the Constitution of the United States. Our subject, religion and the Constitution. Our Constitution, hammered out in the long debate in Philadelphia in 1787, went to the states for ratification, bearing one reference to religion. Article 6 states, "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States." After months of debate in the states, the Constitution was ratified. However, the states had also made it clear that the first Congress was expected to act immediately on amendments protecting specific rights, among them religious rights. The Congress, in its first sitting then, debated and passed, and the states subsequently ratified 10 amendments, our Bill of Rights. The First Amendment declares in part, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion," that's the Establishment Clause, "or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," and that's known as the Free Exercise Clause. This brief, albeit comprehensive declaration of religious rights was distilled from a familiar background. The 13 colonies were substantially settled by families fleeing religious persecution in England and Europe, and religion was a dominant factor in the colonies where, by the way, religious persecution was not entirely unknown. The two clauses, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, have since been at the heart of an intense debate on their scope and meaning and on the original intent of the Founding Fathers concerning them. In modern times, that intensity of debate increased markedly on or about 1947 with a Supreme Court opinion. In that opinion, the court held that the Establishment and the Free Exercise Clauses were made wholly applicable to the states by the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. And over time, the application of the Establishment and Free Exercise Clauses to the states through the 14th Amendment played a major role in cases before the Supreme Court. Sunday closing laws, the right to unemployment benefits when a religiously mandated Saturday non-work day made many jobs unavailable, or when a worker for religious reasons quit a job when switched to doing military work, all of this came in front of the court. On the legislative front, in very recent times, as you know, there have been amendments defeated in the Senate concerned with the voluntary vocal and silent prayer. The House rejected an equal access bill designed to assure the student religious groups in public schools the public high schools, have the same rights as secular student clubs to meet on school grounds. There are other issues that seem as pressing to various constituencies: teaching creationism in science education, the Supreme Court's recent creche decision, affirming the constitutionality of including religious symbols in holiday displays on public grounds, and there are issues concerning objector status in military registration and the naming of an official ambassador to the Vatican. Well, to guide us through this complex and contentious relationship between the Constitution and religion, we have an expert panel. On my far right, Mr. Walter Berns, John M. Olin Distinguished Scholar in Constitutional and Legal Studies at the American Enterprise Institute and the author of the First Amendment and the Future of American Democracy. He also teaches at the University of Chicago. On my immediate right, Representative Henry J. Hyde, Republican member of the House of Representatives from Illinois in his 5th term. He's a member of the House Judiciary Committee, the Subcommittee on Courts, Civil Liberties, and the Administration of Justice. On my immediate left, Mr. Ed Dorr, Executive Director of Americans for Religious Liberty and the former editor of Church and State magazine. And on my far left, the Reverend Barry Lynn, Legislative Counsel in the Washington office of the American Civil Liberties Union. He has been Legislative Counsel in the Office for Church in Society, United Church of Christ. He is also an ordained minister of the United Church of Christ. Well, to begin, gentlemen, I would pose the same question to each of you in turn. In general, does government have an obligation to support religion as one way of helping to sustain a free society? Our nation's motto is, "In God we trust." The President, members of Congress, judges, and other public servants often swear their oaths of office on the Bible. Each day of the congressional session begins with a prayer for guidance. And so should government help strengthen religious values in these and other ways? First of all, let me ask Representative Hyde.
Well, I think it may do so within the parameters of the Constitution as long as it does not prefer one sect or group over another, but it always has. The hostility towards all religions that seems to be the progeny of the Everson case has never been true. We have supported chaplains not only in the military, but for the House and for the Senate. The first chaplain was named William Lynn, by the way, Reverend, and Madison was on the committee that set up that procedure. So we've always had relationships of a sort with the religious groups, but the Constitution requires that it be in such a way as to not set up a state religion, a national religion, and certainly not to prefer one over another.
All right, Mr. Dorr.
I think the best thing that the state can do for religion is to keep its hands off it, to let religion stay in the private sector. Government should not force citizens involuntarily through taxation to support religion. Government should not meddle with the religious lives of children or adults. It should not discriminate in any way for or against various churches. And unfortunately, while our whole history for 2 centuries since the adoption of the Constitution has been one of reaffirming and furthering the separation of church and state that Jefferson and Madison spoke so highly of, in the last few years we have seen tremendous efforts being made for the piecemeal repeal of the First Amendment through drives in state capitals and in Congress to tax people for the support of religious institutions, efforts to amend the Constitution to authorize civil servants to meddle with children's religious lives, efforts by government to interfere with the conscientious right of women to determine whether or not they will be mothers, the President's recent extension of diplomatic relations to a single church in discrimination against all others, are some of the examples of how government has been moving away from the constitutionally required neutrality toward religion towards something else that is rather vaguely old-worldish about it.
Right, Mr. Berns.
Your question used the word obligation, whether the government has an obligation to do this. And strictly speaking, of course, the government has no obligation in the sense that it has a constitutional obligation, as stated in Article 4 of the Constitution, to see to it that guarantee a Republican form of government to each of the states. So the question really is not whether the government has an obligation, but whether it would be well advised to do this, or whether there are some compelling reasons why it should do this. I agree with Mr. Dorr that, of course, the purpose of the First Amendment was to subordinate religion and subordinate it to the private sphere. So the question then becomes as to whether the government is forbidden by the First Amendment to provide assistance to religion in the private sphere and to act in one way or another to see to it that religion in the private sphere maintains its vitality. The answer to that question probably turns on whether it is understood by us, as it was understood by Americans in the beginning, that there is some connection between the sort of moral training that the churches provide and a healthy liberal democracy in the United States. That, I think, is the way the issue should be phrased.
All right. Reverend Barry Lynn.
I think it's important that we recognize that the government may not be hostile to religion, but it must evince a very strict neutrality in regard to religion, and that means at least several things. First of all, it needs to preserve the right of conscience for all Americans, so that to the maximum extent possible, persons are not forced to support religious practices which they find themselves in disagreement about. Secondly, it means that the government must rigidly keep itself uninvolved in religious matters and may not supervise religious institutions. Neutrality means the avoidance of the creation of political warfare over issues that are sectarian religious matters and should remain such. And finally, government neutrality is necessary in regard to religion so as not to degrade the practice of religion itself. And I think the question for this decade and the decades to come is not so much what the framers may have thought about the Constitution nearly 200 years ago, but how those majestic generalities within the First Amendment are to be construed today as concrete restraints on what the government can do in the decades to come.
In other words, the Constitution changes its meaning over time?
I think the Constitution is a living document. It must remain such. And in fact, it's very interesting. Mr. Hyde mentioned that James Madison voted for the establishment of congressional chaplains. I also think it's important to realize that he, several years later as president, wrote a document in opposition to the continuation of the practice of having congressional chaplains because he felt it was a First Amendment violation. So even if not the beginning, at the time he was president, I'm sure he would have fit in very well in the American Civil Liberties Union.
Yeah, but the issue is whether the Constitution changes its meaning over time, and apparently your answer to that question is yes, it did. It does indeed change its meaning over time. So what controls the direction in which the Constitution moves?
The circumstances and that delicate balance between how one balances the requirements of the Free Exercise Clause with the guarantee that there shall be no establishment of religion. There is a tension in the clauses, whether the initial framers of the Constitution recognized it or not. There is a tension, perhaps that's too polite. In some ways, there is a contradiction between those two clauses. Yeah. And I think the issue is that to the maximum extent possible, we must guarantee the right of conscience and the right of free exercise so that persons may exercise their conscience fully and completely in accord with their religious beliefs.
I want to, if I can jump in, I agree with virtually everything you've said, Reverend Lynn, but I think a much more important fundamental question Mr. Berns raised is how does this living document change and how do we learn what its changes mean? Now, if an unelected group of 9 people, men and women, are going to, through some insight, or as Justice Jackson said in his concurring opinion in Everson, no law but our own prepossessions, if that is going to determine what this document means today in this environment, rather than the legislative branch, which is accountable, electable, and recallable by the people, then we've gotten away from the consent of the governed, and we're back to the divine right of kings.
But see, if you create this dichotomy, then you create the possibility that majority rule, as reflected by members of Congress and their constituents, is the arbiter, the final arbiter of constitutional values.
No,
and I think it's
disagree.
been clear that since Marbury versus Madison that in fact it's the Supreme Court that is the arbiter finally of what the First Amendment and the rest of the Constitution means.
Well,
and that's the way it should be.
Yeah, but I would suggest that their task is to adjudicate and not to legislate, not to find things there that weren't there, never were contemplated by the framers, because the framers in their wisdom provided a way to amend the Constitution, but they made it tough. They made an extraordinary majority to be required in the House and in the Senate, and then 38 states ratify. That's tough, but they didn't say that a majority of five men or women on the court can change the Constitution. They said you go out to the people and change it. That's what we've gotten away from.
They're not changing it.
Whether they change the Constitution is a matter of opinion, but the Constitution was written 200 years ago. The founders are long since dead. When there is an apparent conflict over constitutional rights, the Supreme Court doesn't exactly legislate, but it settles disputes between parties, people who go into court with a real controversy or case. And they both make constitutional claims. And the Supreme Court and the lower federal courts have to decide who has the better claim in the light of the Constitution. So I think it's stretching things to say that they are legislating. They are the guardians of the Constitution, and without them, Congress could run roughshod over our liberties, as it has sometimes done in the heat of passion.
Well, the question is whether they're guardians of the Constitution whose meaning remains relatively fixed, or the guardians of something that they themselves create. If they are the guardians of something they themselves create, there's no problem here at all, because they will guard it like the father guards his child and the miser his money.
What is your solution to that?
Solution to what? I'm just asking, I keep asking the question here as to whether the Constitution changes its meaning. And the Constitution says a president has to be 35 years of age. Now, does the living quality of the Constitution indicate that in time that 35 will mean something other than 35?
Could I suggest here that a process by which 35 can become something else is an amendment process, and that is there and available to be used?
Yeah, well, Congressman Hyde spoke about that.
There's very little that is necessary to interpret the meaning of 35 years of age. There's a great deal of interpretation necessary when we're talking about the free exercise of religion or the guarantee of no establishment of religion. And that's what the Supreme Court is designed to do and capable of doing. And whether you or I agree with all of their decisions, they are the people vested with the power to make those decisions.
Reverend Lynn, unless we agree that these words in the First Amendment mean something, our discussion here today will be your opinion about the Constitution versus my opinion of the Constitution, and neither opinion is to be preferred to the other. We have to agree that these words mean something. I agree that the two parts of the First Amendment, religious parts of the First Amendment, contradict each other when carried to the extreme. Nevertheless, one can learn something from those words. One can learn something from what the members of the first Congress said with respect to them. One can learn something from what James Madison had. One can learn something from the political philosophy that informed this amendment. But the words have to mean something, or we're just uttering opinions up here. The question I posed originally was this, and I think this is a fair statement of it. Do we agree or disagree that religion, morality, and knowledge are necessary to good government? If they are, then it might follow, and the First Amendment might have room for a program of assistance on a non-discriminatory basis across the board to all churches, all religions, all sects. That, I think, is my position. In fact, I know that is my position, and I suspect it's Congressman Hyde's position.
As late as 1896, Congress was appropriating $500,000 for religious education of the Indians. So whether the Supreme Court never bit into the Establishment Clause till 1947 in the Everson case.
May I interrupt to ask if we can't come to tussle with what is going on the present scene? I mentioned earlier that the Senate had defeated proposed amendments to the Constitution relating to voluntary prayer in public schools, silent prayer. Neither was passed in the Senate in spite of strong evidence in public opinion polls that a large majority of Americans favored some form of voluntary prayer in public and in public schools. Should public polling play a paramount part in congressional and court decisions on religious issues?
No.
No, it absolutely should not, although that was one of the principal arguments used by those who would amend the Constitution, not for what is truly voluntary prayer, because truly voluntary prayer is permitted in schools now. The ACLU, no state school board official is going to come into a school lunchroom and try to stop someone from saying grace before he or she has lunch. No one's going to try to stop a basketball player from crossing himself before he takes the foul shot. But what the Senate was attempting to do was to prescribe a minute set aside at the beginning of each school day for the states to permit state-selected, not necessarily state-written, but state-selected prayer, which would be sectarian prayer, which would be the establishment of religion, and which would be a very serious conflict, not just with the Establishment Clause as it exists today, but with the very notion of government neutrality in regard to religion.
You see, I have trouble with that. I'm not thrilled about some particular religious philosophy being thrust on anybody, especially with the discipline that a school structure has. But by the same token, it just seems incongruous that state legislatures, the federal Congress opens every day with a prayer prescribed by somebody. I've never been asked for my selection, by a chaplain who is paid with tax dollars, and the Supreme Court says God save the Constitution and this court. Oaths are taken on Bibles. Everybody can pray one way or the other in a structured manner except the kid in school.
But when the Congress prays in the morning, they all don't stand up and recite the same prayer. Every member of Congress doesn't do this. And incidentally,
we usually bow our head and listen.
Yeah, but let's staying in the modern reference. Now, let's go to the silent prayer in this context.
But you know, in your own state of Illinois, Mr. Hyde, school prayer was done away with before any of us were born. And the citizens of Illinois who've grown up since 1900 don't seem to have been any the worse for it.
Well, in fact, we have some problems in Illinois, in Chicago. I'll take you for a walk some evening, and we'll both pray. We get out of the neighborhood.
Okay.
Well, let's do it. Let's do it on the streets, not in the schools. But I think silent prayer is another issue. Silent prayer is another issue that in fact, means a great deal more than it might sound at first blush. There was an effort made to pass a silent prayer amendment to the Constitution, which would have mandated essentially a moment of silent religious activity during the day. And the very selection of that mode of prayer is a dramatic step for any government to take. Many people, of course, are offended by silent prayer. In fact, some of my more fundamentalist Christian friends believe that it is absolutely blasphemous to participate in silent prayer, because prayer in their tradition must be oral for it to have any meaning. So the mere selection of silent against vocal prayer is a major distinction with a great theological significance, and certainly not something which the Congress ought to be legislating about.
I'm thinking of introducing a bill to at least commemorate the usefulness of, in all schools, young people pulling out their old Declaration of Independence and reading that part about, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. I think it would be therapeutic, if not instructive, to cogitate on what our very founding fathers, way before the Constitution, had in mind.
Every child may do this now in
I
every public
understand
school.
that. It isn't done, and I think it ought to be done.
Now, can we go, pardon me, to the equal access issue in the House? Would you like to discuss that, Walter?
What interests me about that is the lack of public discussion as to the constitutional authority for the national government to decide whether the school system or the schools of, say, Ottumwa, Iowa, should or should not admit a certain group and give them access to school facilities to conduct a meeting. We have gone so far in this country that it's no longer a matter of discussion, that the national government is assumed to have the authority to dictate that to Ottumwa. I mean, that's astonishing, really. Now, of course, the Constitution, the authority here is said to, well, it's in fact tied to the giving out of money. And if you give money and promise to or threaten to withhold it, you can do practically anything under this Constitution, and that raises problems. As to the access question itself, what interests me about this is that it was decided that religious groups might not have access on the basis of the Supreme Court's decision with respect to this question. If the Communist Party wanted access and if the schools refused that access, the court would rule in favor of the Communist Party. Conclusion: communists may have use of our public facilities, religious groups may not. And that, I think, was probably not intended by James Madison.
Well, I would say, of course, that you're right, Mr. Berns, that it's high-handed of Congress to dictate policy to the school board in Ottumwa, Iowa, or to someplace in Idaho either. But the real issue was the gross abuses that could creep in, or that would be plainly there if the Equal Access Bill had been passed. There was nothing in there to prevent the proselytizing of children as young as 11 or 12 in the 7th grade by outside adult missionaries. And this sort of thing happens in many public schools. There was no safeguard against that in the bill. The sponsor of the bill had no interest in approving of an amendment to the bill to provide these safeguards.
If I could jump in, because I had real problems with that bill. I frankly, my instinct was to support it on a libertarian theory that it is a public building paid for by public funds, and that it ought to be available to the public in an orderly fashion, not chaos, so long as it's non-discriminatorily made available. So if the Moonies, if Hare Krishna want to come in, They're as entitled to exercise free speech as you or I are entitled to, much as I would disagree with what they would do. But I did not see how we could shut the door to one group and not to another, or shut the door to all groups under our Constitution.
This is a much more radical approach to religion in the public schools than even a moment of prayer, because it does allow religious services, it allows doctrinal instruction, as well as these efforts to convert other students right in the corridors and the classrooms of America's public schools.
But now, can we discuss this for a minute, in the light of the fact that the court has held that at the university level, public university level, that equal access must be given to all groups if you give access to some. Now, what is the great difference between that procedure now practiced in our universities and what is proposed in the public high school?
Well, there has to be a dividing line between people who are old enough not to be easily sucked into something and people who are young and immature. We have an age for acquiring a driver's license, for consuming alcohol, for getting married, and so too...
for learning about God, is that it?
We have institutions for learning about God, and those are called churches and synagogues. We also, the Supreme Court itself has said that the public schools may offer objective academic instruction about religion, and there's a lot of it going on that's perfectly respectable in our public schools.
You equate handling liquor then, you require a level of maturity then before these ideas may be foisted on young
we draw
minds.
lines. We draw lines. For instance, we draw a line at the lower level. We won't let children into school until they're a certain age.
But sex education for the little ones is okay, even though it's usually plumbing.
Let's time.
But not prayer.
No, but I think
Time.
there's one very important distinction that also makes a difference between the University of Missouri and a junior high school in Illinois, and that is that the university was an open forum. It was truly open to every known organization.
Equal access.
Equal access was truly there. Right. And in America's public schools today, it is just as difficult. In fact, I'd submit it's more difficult to get a club to study Karl Marx than it is to get a club to study the Bible.
I really would think the ACLU would be pushing for equal access, even for the ideas we don't agree with. Your proudest moment was the toughest moment you ever had, and that was defending the Nazis' right to march. I wouldn't have done that. I mean, I think that they would cause a riot, and therefore it was too inflammatory, but that took guts, and I don't agree with everything you've done.
In a public forum of that public park, we do support it, but for the same reasons that we don't want religious worship services to occur in school, we don't want the Hitler Youth movement to meet in school during school hours, because that would give the state imprimatur or blessing on racially discriminatory activity in violation of the Constitution.
Because time is fleeting, may I take you to tuition tax credits? And Representative Hyde, this is an area of your particular interest. Would you speak to it? Which the issue is a very simple one. Some parents have decided that their children would receive a better education, perhaps including a deeper religious education in private schools, both run by religious and by non-religious, and that they bear two burdens of tax under that principle, and therefore that is perfectly reasonable. There should be some return in tuition tax credits.
Well, ever since 1925, the Supreme Court has held that if you send your child to a parochial school, you are fulfilling the requirements, the secular requirement of a public education, a good education, so long as the Board of Education is certified that you're getting a decent education. Now, if you can fulfill the state law requirement by sending your child to a parochial school, I don't see the constitutional difficulty. Now, we can argue the wisdom. That's really another question, and I'm really prepared to argue that too. But I see no constitutional infirmity towards providing tuition tax credits, which are really saying to the parent, you don't have to bear this double burden. We'll let you keep some of your own money because your child is going to a parochial school. It has been held by the court that these tax credits, for instance, the money you put in the collection box on Sunday, is not establishing a religion. That's been held by the court, so I shouldn't think tuition tax credits would be establishing a religion either. I'm not talking about the wisdom, which I do support, but the constitutionality.
Well, you seem to think that there hasn't been any constitutional history of this. The Supreme Court back in 72 and 73 and subsequent decisions examined several tuition tax credit programs from New York, from Ohio, from New Jersey, and found them to be clearly unconstitutional. They were transferring money from the public treasury, for which we are all taxed, into the treasuries of religious institutions.
What about when you go to church on Sunday and you put your $20 bill in the collection? And you write that off on your income tax.
We all get deductions.
What's the difference between
We all get deductions for contributions to religious,
churches,
charitable, and eleemosynary organizations. And that's across the board. It hits everybody. But tax support for specifically religious institutions, the way tuition tax credits are, the Supreme Court has found that that violates the Constitution. There's a further infirmity in that, which the court did not even need to get to because it didn't need to be brought up, and that is that tax aid through tuition tax credits or vouchers or any other scheme provides public support for the various kinds of invidious discrimination that are practiced by non-public schools. Creedal segregation, class discrimination, academic discrimination. There are a number of forms of discrimination that are practiced in non-public schools that would never be tolerated in public schools. Any form of federal or state aid to non-public schools means we're taxed to support those forms of discrimination.
As long as the tax credit is across the board to Methodist, to Lutheran, to Jewish schools, to Roman Catholic schools, it would be my position there is no constitutional infirmity if there is no preference of one over the other.
Let's move to the battle being fought on the issues of science education. On the one hand, some legislators and educators around the country argue that evolution remains but one theory of man's beginning and that the biblical account of creation is another. Therefore, they conclude both theories should be taught as part of students' science education. On the other hand, the argument is made that evolution is science, while the teaching of biblical creationism only serves to advance religion and should not be taught as a science. Now, who would like to start?
I think that this is a nearly bogus issue of phony equality of treatment. There's nothing similar between the scientific theory of evolution and the religious theory of creationism. I think creationism probably should be taught in public schools. It should be taught in a comparative religion class where it belongs, but it should not be in the public schools masquerading as science. Science begins with observation, goes to experimentation, then tries to find the truth or to falsify the hypotheses that it develops. Creationism starts with the conclusion everything was created by God 10,000 years ago, and then seeks to find miscellaneous bits of information from a variety of sciences to support the conclusion. That is not science.
Kind of like a Supreme Court decision. They get the result and then they look for ways to justify it. I would say that an educated person ought to know about the theory of creationism as well as evolution or any other theories, and they ought to be presented to the kids in a non-discriminatory way. The teacher can say, I prefer this, or this is scientific, this is a leap of faith, but there are people who believe in creationism, and I think your education's incomplete if you don't understand it.
But you don't think it should be taught as science in the biology books of the United States?
Absent an answer to the question of the uncaused cause, I don't think it's unscientific to say there are those who believe that a force created something out of nothing, because science doesn't yet tell us about the uncaused cause.
No, but neither do biology textbooks about evolution. They leave that first cause, the uncaused cause, out of biology books for good reason.
You can say, now take your science hat off and put your religion hat on, and we're going to talk about creationism. But an educated person should know about both theories.
But this teacher cannot take off his science hat and put on a religion hat. He has to be neutral.
That's the sad thing.
Well, which religion would you have him put on?
All of them. All of them. The major religions: Muslimism, Judaism, Christianity.
This may be done in the social studies now and in comparative religion classes. I'm a former social studies teacher. I talked about religious issues in an academic, neutral way. This can be done. It is being done by thousands and thousands of teachers.
Well, I know when you're talking about the creationism in science, you shouldn't have to go to recess and go down the hall.
But do you want every religious doctrine that has something to do with explaining man's relationship to the universe to be taught?
Just the major ones.
But you're the person who just a few minutes ago said you shouldn't draw any distinctions about religions. Unification Church, Baptist, Methodist, Catholic, they're all the same.
You're going to spend. I don't think there are that many theories about creationism. I don't think the Methodists and the Baptists have a different theory. They may not agree on any theory.
Well, but there aren't only Methodists and Baptists in the United States. There are, I think, 415 identifiable religious groups in this country today.
How
and many of those,
theories of the creation of the world are there?
I would think there are indeed hundreds of theories of the creation of the world.
Well, an educated person should know that fact.
Well, let's move to the creche decision in the Supreme Court. You know, recently the court ruled that in the so-called Pawtucket case, that it's constitutional for creches to be included in holiday displays on public grounds.
Let me speak to the Pawtucket situation. That's a beautiful example of why the ACLU should keep its nose out of public business. That was a case in which the ACLU filed the suit. The creche was not on public property. It was purchased with public funds. The question ought to be raised as to why the court grants standing in this particular case. My point here is that many of these issues ought not to be litigated. And so I would ask the court to ask the ACLU, what skin off your nose is it that we have this creche in Pawtucket? And if you insist on bringing this case to the court, you might very well lose. And as a matter of fact, you lost. Now, what did you lose and what have we lost because you lost that particular case? I would imagine that in the past, many a city councilman, many a mayor has said in effect to some importunate constituent who asks for a religious display and so forth, Charlie, you know doggone well we can't do that. That gets into First Amendment, and the city can't put creches on top of the Palm Olive building and so forth and so on. The consequence of the ACLU's pushing that suit is you have deprived every mayor around the country of that response to all the Charlies. And there are lots of Charlies of lots of religions. Yeah. But pretty soon the public world was going to be festooned with a variety of religious symbols.
I'll tell you, one of the things that Justice Black said once was that when you mix government and religion, you tend to destroy governments and degrade religions. And I think that in Pawtucket we have the perfect example of the degradation of an important religious symbol because some Charlie in that state got his way with the mayor and the city council. Here, in fact, is the second most important symbol of the Christian faith, the manger scene, the baby Jesus. In the middle of clowns, a talking wishing well, an elephant, a blue bear, some reindeer in the Santa Claus house. Yeah. Now, if I cannot imagine anything more degrading to the symbol, this central symbol of Christianity, than that scene. I'm surprised that someone didn't come out in the middle of the night and destroy the scene in the Pawtucket Square, not because of constitutional objections, but because of blasphemous objections.
Now, the consequences of the ACLU filing the suit and the court granting standing to the ACLU is you're going to have that important symbol of Christianity surrounded by red-nosed reindeer all over this broad land. Thank you very much, ACLU.
We already were doing it, and the proof is in the pudding of that suit and other suits around the country that involve religious symbols, mixing them with secular symbols, so that those parents who are deeply religious and deeply Christian and who take the matter of Christmas seriously and try our darndest to keep apart the secular meaning of Christmas and Santa Claus from the historic and religious meaning of the birth of Jesus Christ.
Well, I think we've covered several of the major areas of conflict with respect to the Constitution and religion, and that in fairness to this fine audience we have, who must have some questions, that we've come to the question and answer session. May I have the first question, please?
Those of us in this room have listened with great interest to this discussion of what's constitutionally permissible and what isn't. With your permission, I'd like to ask a public policy question and direct it to all of the members of the panel. My question is this. What makes you think that state support of religion in any form will do some good? And what evidence do you have for that? And equally, what makes you think that state support of religion will do harm? And what evidence do you have for that?
Who volunteers to start? Walter?
I'll start. This is not evidence, Mr. Ranney, but it's testimony. It was the opinion of George Washington, of course, uttered in his farewell address, that there was a connection between morality, to use our word, and the viability of our Republican institutions. Further testimony is provided by Tocqueville, who at great length developed this theme and indicated that the good health of the United States really did depend upon the continuation of certain habits. Tocqueville probably provides the most thematic treatment of this subject available to us, and in his discussion of it, it was really a question of how in this, under this Constitution, under democratic auspices, when everything points to individualism and taking care of oneself, how somehow does one remind all of us, all citizens of the United States, that we have some responsibility towards others. And I would suppose that religious education does, in fact, somehow go some way to reminding us of that.
I am inclined to agree with Mr. Berns. One is tempted to say it might not help, but it certainly couldn't hurt in terms of an objective, non-discriminatory recognition of the fatherhood of God if a majority of people in a given community feel that way. It's awfully hard to work on the brotherhood of man without some notion of the fatherhood of God. At least I found it hard to prove the basic tenet that all men are created equal. Clearly, mankind is different. There are smart ones and dumb ones, talented ones and klutzes and all of those things. But if you don't consider the essentials, which are really God-given, you have problems with our basic philosophy. An objective standard of morality, I think, is what we need rather than all of these 235 million subjective standards of morality. So I, being very chary about abuses and preferences and that sort of thing, I would like to see a little more return to the fatherhood of God notion.
Mr. Durham?
Of course, there are many people of both genders who might feel that assigning a gender to God is government taking a position that's out of line.
She doesn't mind.
Okay, whatever. Or they?
It.
Whatever. I think that Madison hit the nail on the head in his memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments in 1785 when he called attention to the fact that when government aids religion, it corrupts the clergy, it just messes everything up. And I think the evidence of history is that those countries where there is a close union of church and state, where government subsidizes religion, promotes it, tries to help it, religion itself becomes corrupted and an ally frequently of very bad politics. The American experience, I think Cardinal Cushing pointed it out and lots of other people, that because we have pretty much implemented the church-state separation principle in this country, we have had more religious tolerance, more religious freedom than any other society has ever known. And when something works right, as one of Murphy's corollaries has it, don't mess with it. Church-state separation has been a great boon to our country. It's our perhaps most significant contribution to civilization. We should leave it alone and try to enhance it.
May I add something to this? I should not like Mr. Doerr's response to this question to go as the final word on this question. Essentially, he was saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Let us not indulge the idea that the history of the United States is almost 200 unbroken years of complete separation of church and state. It certainly is not. There is more separation of church and state now than there was in the past. There was certainly more since the Supreme Court nationalized the First Amendment, and this became a national question. There was certainly more association of church and state in the states, on the state level, at the municipal level, in the past. Well, that's enough.
Well, you're quite right, but I think we have been making progress, and this is to the good that we have a greater separation now than we did 185 years ago.
If I could just follow through for a moment, I'm not satisfied that it ain't broke in terms of society today. The narcotic problem is a tidal wave, whether we know it or not. It is. In sports, among kids in school. Pornography, we're so used to it now, it doesn't seem to do much. But
What's
it is
that got
a serious,
to do with government meddling with religion?
A serious problem. I'm talking about the getting away from the notion of right and wrong and of God. An objective standard of morality, a sanction for doing wrong other than doing what your nerve endings say will gratify me now. So I think society is certainly damaged, if not broken, and we should be looking for some answers. And a book on ethics, it works better this way, ain't enough, in my opinion.
Justice Rehnquist has said recently some, I think, frightening things about America today. He has suggested that religious divisiveness is not a real problem in 20th century America. And I think that we've seen in the process of the last few months of debate over these volatile issues like school prayer and equal access, some of the most intense demagoguery to support governmental intrusions into religious matters, demagoguery that has surpassed, in my experience of 10 years in Washington lobbying on all kinds of unpopular causes. Never have I received the mail, the hatred, the threats that I have received simply because I think that government should be out of the prayer writing and the prayer selecting business. And those very valiant and courageous members of the United States Senate who fought the school prayer amendment on the floor received letters consistently that were as disgraceful to legitimate and honest political debate as any I have ever seen on any issue. I think the potential for religious divisiveness occurs. It occurs in communities around this country when religious clubs begin to meet in high schools. We see neighbors pitted against neighbors, children pitted against neighbors, literally homes burned down of those courageous people within the community who protest the activities that are going on in the public schools. We are a hair's breadth away from true internecine, interreligious warfare in the United States. And what we have seen happening in communities all over the country would certainly increase dramatically if we sent any constitutional amendment about church and state out for ratification by all the states.
I want to dissociate myself with what Reverend Lynn said and to say that we are a hair's breadth away from Khomeini's Iran or Ian Paisley's Northern Ireland or Archbishop Laud's 17th century Britain, I think, is hyperbole. I also would want to say to Mr. Dorr, the issue is not government supporting religion. The issue is, for example, whether tax exemption should be given to church property and so forth and so on. And the Supreme Court has upheld that. That's the issue, not whether we have an established church in the full sense of the term. There's no one on this panel wants an established church in the United States, I think. Everybody on this panel is in favor of toleration. Everyone on this panel would abhor the situation that Reverend Lynn describes and certainly would not take any action leading to it.
Next question, please. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Dick Howard of the University of Virginia. The panel has made clear the role of the Supreme Court, especially since 1947, in importing the notion of the wall of separation into its First Amendment religion decisions. In light of that, it's rather striking that the last three significant Supreme Court decisions have all been, in effect, accommodationist. They have all upheld challenged state measures. The Minnesota case upholding tuition tax credits, the Nebraska case upholding the paying of chaplains, and the Pawtucket, Rhode Island case upholding the display of the creche. I'm curious to know, and I direct this question to any or all the members of the panel, whether you think those three cases represent simply some marginal adjustment in the court's thinking about the First Amendment, or are we now, all these years after Everson, beginning to see something that may portend a major adjustment in the direction of permitting more accommodation by states and by government generally of religious practices in the public arena?
I wouldn't call what's happened simple accommodation, because there is long and serious and thoughtful case law about accommodating religious beliefs. In other words, at what point can one exempt individuals on religious grounds from laws of general applicability? I think that these decisions that you mentioned have gone much further than that. They're not accommodation. They come dangerously close to what we mean by establishment, by the very non-neutrality that creates the dangers I posed in the beginning of this program. That is the degrading of religion, the trivializing of religion, the creation of political warfare between and among religious groups. I think they're bad decisions. Most of them, thankfully, are very narrow decisions. And I think it will, to some degree, depend on the quality and the capabilities of the next few appointees to the Supreme Court as to whether this will be a floodgate toward establishment instead of a responsible recognition of accommodation.
Mulder?
Well, I disagree. I think they're fine decisions. I think the absolute nature of the Everson decision is being recognized as based on non-scholarship. It wasn't based on how the first Congress and the framers felt and acted, and the early presidents, but based on how the court felt the law ought to be at that time. But whether it will continue, again, it's interesting. It depends on the personnel of the court. So much depends on the personnel of the court. And that's the vice of letting the court write legislation or rewrite the Constitution according to their prepossessions. It's interesting, around the turn of the century, the court was anathema to the progressive forces of America because it was reactionary. Today, or recently, when it is a liberal court, it is the darling of the progressive forces, and Congress, the elected body, is anathema. So it ebbs and flows depending on the liberality or reactionary nature of the court.
Next question. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Elizabeth Little, and I'm a member of Concerned Women for America. Mr. Lynn, you stated that you are against any doctrinal instruction of children. Many parents find it in extreme disfavor that their children are being taught situational ethics in school with public tax money. They personally believe that there are intrinsic rights and intrinsic wrongs, and they find this philosophy of situational ethics quite a conflict with their own moral standards. What rights do you think that these parents have?
I think that parents have the right to expect that in a class which is about to teach questions of values, that students are taught that some people believe that there are different values depending on the situations, and that other people believe that there are fundamental, correct, right and wrong positions on the great moral questions of the day. And I think that any school that is not teaching that both of those are responsible ways to do moral analysis is a school district that needs a little help, and its teachers need a little help. But I do resist the idea that I believe is a part of your question, that somehow situational ethics has been proscribed as the national or state religion, or that secular humanism, or that some other phrase that generally reflects whatever a person doesn't seem to like, has been established as the national religion. It has not. Neither has situational ethics. Courses in ethics and how one does moral reasoning is appropriate in the schools, and it should reflect the many, many dozens of varieties of ethical thinking.
I'm on the National Council of the Humanities, and the question of support from federal tax dollars comes up quite frequently with respect to situational ethics or some variety of it, and the teaching of these things at 7th grade level, for example. My own view is, if I can encapsulate it, I would prefer to have children at that level told, with some authority behind it, that it is wrong to murder another human being or to steal from that other human being, or etc., than it is to have these subjects introduced as debatable propositions. And I think that's a fair way of stating it. And if we are concerned about, as the Supreme Court is, and has made a rule of law out of, the difference between older and younger, and what might be done in colleges with older people and not done with children younger, because younger are more impressionable, I think that carries over here too. I want to impress on young people that murdering other human beings is not debatable.
When you get beyond those two examples, what is the basis for the moral absolutes that you would teach?
Yeah, but that's absolutely, I recognize that. We have to avoid anything that leads us in the direction of Ian Paisley or the Ayatollah Khomeini, etc. I don't minimize the problem at all, Reverend Lynn.
Of course, teaching values in school is not a simple matter of 1, 2, 3, this is the truth, and you don't question it. I think teachers have a more sophisticated approach to the situation. You don't say a murder is wrong simply because I say so or because it's in the Ten Commandments. It is appropriate for a teacher to encourage a class of kids to discuss why a murder is wrong, why stealing is wrong, and you encourage the kids to...
You try with me, Mr. Dorr, and I can figure out some reasons why it isn't, and I suspect the 10-year-old can too.
All right, next question, please. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask the panelists to comment on the recent U.S. appointment of a ambassador to the Holy See.
I don't think it's any big deal, frankly. I think it's a change in title. I know it offended a lot of people that it was an ambassador to a religion and hence a violation. I don't know if it was worth all of the fuss that it created, although it didn't create all that much fuss. I don't recall Congress dealing with it at all, but I don't think it's an earth-shaking event, frankly.
I think it certainly gives added credibility to the notion that one religion is favored, and that is the Roman Catholic faith, because we don't have an ambassador going to the World Council of Churches in Geneva, Switzerland, serving as a representative of the United States. And I think the other thing that it does...
I'd vote for that if they did.
Would you? Yeah. Even the World Council of Churches?
Sure.
What about Reverend Moon?
They might learn something from our ambassador.
Let me just finish. I think the other thing is that it does give a favored status to this church because it makes it enormously more... it makes it much easier for that religious organization to speak to the United States government through the Department of State. It gives a corridor to them that is not given to any other faith.
Somehow or the other, we wandered into another thicket in answering that question, and I much regret our time is all gone. This concludes another Public Policy Forum presented by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. Goodbye from Washington.
It is the aim of AEI to clarify issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints, in the hope that by doing so, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. AEI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, publicly supported research and education organization. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.